My name is Sarah, and this is the story of the night I finally understood that silence can be louder than cruelty and far more dangerous for a child who is still learning who she is. This is not a story about shouting, insults, or broken plates at a family dinner. It's about laughter. The kind that feels harmless to the people laughing, but heavy enough to follow a child into her dreams. For most of my life, I believed silence was strength. I was raised to think that staying quiet kept families together, that reacting made things worse, and that love often meant enduring discomfort with a smile. In our house, feelings were something you managed privately. Problems were something you ignored publicly. And jokes, no matter how sharp, were never meant to be questioned. That belief followed me into adulthood, into marriage, into motherhood. When my daughter Emma was born, everything I thought I knew about strength slowly began to change. She was perfect in the way only a newborn can be. Tiny fingers, curious eyes, and a calmness that made the world feel gentler. It wasn't until later that we learned she had partial hearing loss. The diagnosis didn't arrive with drama. No tears, no panic, just a quiet explanation in a sterile room and a doctor who spoke gently, like he didn't want to scare us. I remember holding Emma afterward, feeling her warm weight against my chest, and thinking how unfair it was that the world would already demand something extra from her. I promised myself, right there, that I would protect her from cruelty as long as I could. What I didn't understand yet was that cruelty doesn't always arrive as anger. Sometimes it arrives smiling. The hearing aid became part of Emma's life gradually. At first, she resisted it. It felt strange, foreign, like something that made her different. But children are resilient in ways adults forget. She adapted. She learned how to adjust it herself. She learned how to read faces, tones, pauses. She learned how to exist in a world that wasn't built with her in mind. I was proud of her. Fiercely proud. My family, on the other hand, treated it like a phase. Something temporary. Something we didn't need to talk about too much. They never asked Emma how it felt. They never learned how it worked. They simply acknowledged it existed and moved on, like ignoring it made it less real. And I let that happen, because deep down, I was still that girl who believed silence kept the peace. The dinner invitation came casually. A text from my mother, reminding me how long it had been since we'd all sat together. I hesitated before replying yes. Something in me always tightened before family gatherings, like my body remembered things my mind tried to forget. But Emma was excited. She loved her grandparents. She loved the idea of being included. So I said yes. That night, as we drove to my parents' house, Emma sat quietly in the back seat, humming to herself. The streetlights passed in soft blurs, and for a moment, everything felt calm. Normal. I glanced at her through the rearview mirror and caught her adjusting her hearing aid, the way she always did when she wanted to be sure she wouldn't miss anything important. I smiled. I wish I could say I sensed what was coming. I didn't. The house looked the same as it always had. Warm lights, familiar smells, the comfort of routine. Inside, everyone greeted us with hugs and casual affection. Emma was passed from one set of arms to another, laughing softly, her small voice almost disappearing beneath the noise. The noise. That's what stood out to me. Conversations overlapped, chairs scraped against the floor, laughter erupted, without warning. For most people, it was just a lively family dinner. For Emma, it was exhausting. I noticed how close she stayed to me, how often her hand went to her ear, adjusting, recalibrating, trying to keep up. I should have spoken then. I didn't. I told myself she was fine. She always was. She was strong, remember? As we sat down at the table, I felt that familiar pull to blend in, to not cause trouble, to let things unfold the way they always did. My sister Rachel sat across from us, confident and relaxed, the center of attention as usual. She had always been the loud one, the funny one, the one people excused because she doesn't mean it. I noticed her glance at Emma, then glance again. A small detail, easy to ignore. And so, like I had my entire life, I ignored it. I didn't know then that this was the moment before everything shifted. The calm before the sentence that would change how I saw my family, my father, and myself. The moment before my daughter would learn a lesson no child should ever have to learn at a dinner table meant to feel safe. This section of my story isn't about the joke itself. It's about everything that came before it. Because what happened next didn't hurt so deeply just because of words, but because of years of silence that taught me to hesitate when my child needed me most. And that hesitation is what I would have to face next. By the time dinner was served, the house felt fuller than it really was. Plates were passed around, chairs scraped against the floor, and everyone talked at once, like volume itself was proof of closeness. I watched Emma carefully as she sat beside me, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes moving from face to face as she tried to keep up with the noise. For Emma, listening wasn't passive. It was work. Every laugh required focus. Every overlapping conversation demanded effort. I could see it in the way her shoulders slowly tensed, in the way her fingers reached for her hearing aid again and again, making tiny adjustments only she fully understood. To everyone else, she probably looked quiet. To me, she looked tired. I leaned toward her and asked softly if she was okay. She nodded, offering me a small smile that felt practiced, like she'd learned early how to reassure adults even when she was struggling. That smile carried a familiar sting. It reminded me how often children learn to make themselves easier for the world instead of asking the world to be kinder. Across the table, my sister Rachel was holding court, telling a story loudly, her hands moving dramatically as everyone laughed at the right moments. Rachel had always thrived in attention. Growing up, she was the one teachers remembered, the one relatives praised, the one whose sharp tongue was forgiven because it came wrapped in confidence. If she hurt you, it was your fault for being sensitive. I felt her eyes drift toward Emma again. This time, she didn't look away quickly. She studied the small device behind Emma's ear with open curiosity, like it was something new, something interesting, something she hadn't decided how to label yet. I felt unease settle in my stomach, but I told myself not to overthink it. I'd spent my whole life explaining away Rachel's behavior. Tonight wouldn't be different, I thought. Dinner continued. Forks scraped plates. Glasses clinked. My father laughed loudly at one of Rachel's jokes, the sound deep and familiar. He looked relaxed, comfortable in his role as the man at the head of the table, the one who decided what mattered and what didn't. Emma flinched slightly at the sudden burst of laughter. I reached out and rested my hand gently on her knee. She glanced at me, and for a moment, there was relief in her eyes. That quiet understanding between us felt like a small island in a very loud room. Then Rachel leaned back in her chair. It happened casually, almost lazily. So, she said, her voice cutting through the noise just enough to draw attention, does that hearing thing come with special features? Like Bluetooth or something? Or can Emma hear what we're thinking too? The words landed lightly. Too lightly. For a split second, no one reacted. Then laughter broke out, sharp, sudden, uncontrolled. Not everyone laughed, but enough did. Enough for it to feel unanimous. Enough for it to feel approved. I didn't laugh. I watched Emma. Her body went still in a way no child's ever should. Her fingers froze mid-movement, just touching her hearing aid. Slowly, almost carefully, she lowered her hand, like she'd been caught doing something wrong. Her eyes dropped to her plate, and I saw her shoulders pull inward, collapsing slightly, like she was trying to disappear. That image will never leave me. In that moment, I understood something painful. Children don't need explanations to know when they're being singled out. They feel it instantly, deep in their bodies, before their minds catch up. Emma didn't need to understand the joke to understand that she was the joke. I opened my mouth to speak. Before a single word could leave me, my father waved his hand dismissively, still smiling. "Oh, relax," he said. "It's just a joke. Don't be so sensitive." The room settled, not because the harm was addressed, but because it was dismissed. Rachel smirked, satisfied, like she'd been defended without having to ask. The laughter faded into murmurs as people returned to their food, the moment already forgotten by everyone except the child it had landed on. And me. I felt heat rise in my chest, Not explosive anger, but something heavier. Disappointment. The kind that sinks instead of burns. My father's words echoed in my head, pulling memories from places I hadn't visited in years. Every time I'd been told not to react. Every time I'd been taught that harmony mattered more than honesty. I looked at Emma again. She wasn't crying. That somehow made it worse. Her face was carefully neutral, like she was trying to manage herself, to not cause a scene. She pushed her food around her plate without eating, her appetite gone in seconds. I realized then that she was learning something in real time, that parts of her were acceptable to laugh at, and that adults wouldn't always step in. That realization terrified me. I leaned toward my father. "That wasn't funny," I said quietly. "It was hurtful." He sighed, irritated now. "You're reading too much into it, Sarah. Kids need to learn to take a joke." Rachel rolled her eyes. "Seriously, you're acting like I attacked her." I looked around the table again. No one met my eyes. The silence that followed was thick, not empty, but heavy with avoidance. Everyone waited for me to let it go, to smile, to move on. That was the unspoken rule. That was how things stayed comfortable, and I felt the familiar pull to comply. But something had changed, because this time it wasn't my feelings on the line. It was my daughter's sense of safety. I looked down at Emma, and she finally looked back at me. Her eyes weren't wet, but they were searching, waiting. That same silent question from before lingered there, heavier now. Is this okay? Is this how people are allowed to treat me? I knew then that whatever I did next would teach her something she'd carry for a long time. Staying quiet would be easy, familiar, expected. Speaking up would not be. I took a breath, feeling years of conditioning press against my ribs. I felt the weight of the room, the expectation that I would back down, smooth things over, protect everyone else from discomfort. And for the first time in my life, I understood exactly what that silence would cost. The silence at the table didn't feel empty. It felt crowded, with expectations, with history, with all the unspoken rules I had followed my entire life. Everyone waited, not for an apology from Rachel, but for me to let it go. That was the pattern. That was how things returned to normal. I looked at Emma again. She hadn't touched her food. Her fork rested on the edge of her plate, unmoving. Her shoulders were tense, her small body braced like she was preparing for something unpleasant. I realized she wasn't just waiting for me to speak. She was preparing herself for the possibility that I wouldn't. That thought hit me harder than anything else that night. I felt my chest tighten as memories surfaced. Moments from my own childhood when I'd sat quietly at that same table, learning which feelings were allowed and which ones were inconvenient. I'd learned early that harmony mattered more than honesty, that discomfort was something you endured, not something you challenged. And now, without meaning to, I was standing on the edge of passing that lesson down to my daughter. I couldn't do it. "That wasn't funny," I said again, louder this time. Not angry, steady. It was cruel. The word hung in the air, heavier than I expected. Rachel's smile vanished, replaced by irritation. "Wow," she said, laughing sharply. "You're really going to turn this into a thing?" Before I could respond, my father leaned forward, his voice firm, final. "Enough, Sarah. You're ruining dinner." Ruining dinner. Not hurting a child. Not mocking a disability. Ruining dinner. Something inside me shifted at that moment. The disappointment I'd been holding cracked open, revealing clarity beneath it. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't thoughtlessness. It was a choice to protect comfort over compassion. I looked around the table one last time. My mother stared down at her plate. My relatives avoided my gaze. No one spoke up. No one challenged my father's words. Silence wrapped itself around the room, thick and suffocating. I realized then that if I stayed seated, that silence would become Emma's lesson. I pushed my chair back. The sound was sharp, unmistakable. "Emma," I said gently, keeping my voice calm despite the storm in my chest, "let's go." Her head snapped up, surprise flashing across her face, followed quickly by something else, relief. She didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. She slid off her chair and took my hand, her fingers curling tightly around mine. My father's expression hardened. "You're being dramatic." I met his eyes. "No," I said quietly. "I'm being a mother." For a moment, I thought he might argue. Instead, he shook his head in disbelief, as if I'd broken some unspoken rule. As we walked away from the table, I felt the weight of every stare on my back. No one stopped us. No one followed. The house, once warm and familiar, suddenly felt cold and distant, like I was leaving a place I no longer belonged to. Outside, the night air hit us immediately. Cool, quiet, and grounding. The contrast was almost shocking. After the chaos inside, the silence felt gentle, protective. Emma exhaled deeply, like she'd been holding her breath the entire evening. We walked to the car without speaking. I could feel her emotions buzzing beneath the surface, unsteady but contained. I unlocked the doors and helped her into the passenger seat, fastening her seatbelt with hands that were finally starting to shake. As I closed the door and walked around to the driver's side, the reality of what I'd just done settled in. I had left. I had chosen my child over my family's approval. I sat behind the wheel for a moment, gripping it tightly, trying to steady myself. The house loomed behind us, lights glowing warmly through the windows, as if nothing had happened inside. I wondered how many times I'd driven away from that house as a child, carrying hurt in silence, telling myself it didn't matter. Emma's voice broke through my thoughts. "Mom." I turned to her. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked quietly. My heart dropped. "No," I said immediately, turning fully toward her. "No, sweetheart. You did nothing wrong." She nodded slowly, absorbing my words, then looked down at her hands. "They laughed," she said. "Was it because of this?" She touched her hearing aid carefully, like it might disappear if she acknowledged it too directly. That question broke something open inside me. I reached across the console and took her hand. "They laughed because they weren't thinking," I said gently. "Not because of you." She was quiet for a moment, then whispered, "Should I stop wearing it?" The car felt suddenly too small for that sentence. I pulled over to the side of the street without thinking and turned off the engine. I needed her to hear this, really hear it. "Emma," I said, holding her face so she'd look at me, "that hearing aid doesn't make you weak. It means you're strong enough to adapt to a world that isn't always kind. There is nothing wrong with you." Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She nodded slowly, like she was storing my words somewhere safe. We drove home in silence after that, not the heavy kind from before, but something softer. Processing. Healing, maybe. When we got home, Emma went straight to bed, exhaustion finally catching up with her. I tucked her in, smoothing her hair back, watching her eyes flutter closed. Only then did the weight of the night crash over me. I sat on the edge of her bed long after she fell asleep, replaying everything. The joke, the laughter, my father's words, my own voice when I finally used it. I wondered what the consequences would be. I wondered how this would change things. But underneath the fear, there was something else. Relief. Because for the first time, I hadn't stayed silent. And I knew the hardest part was still coming. That night, after Emma fell asleep, the house felt unnaturally quiet. Not peaceful, just still, like everything was holding its breath. I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every second of the dinner over and over again. The sound of Rachel's laughter echoed in my head, followed closely by my father's voice telling me I was ruining dinner. I realized with a dull ache that what hurt the most wasn't the joke itself, but how easily everyone else had moved on from it. Sometime past midnight, I heard Emma stir. I got up quietly and went to her room. She was turned toward the wall, her small body curled inward. I sat beside her and brushed her hair back gently. She didn't wake up, but I could see tear stains on her pillow. Silent crying. The kind that happens when a child doesn't feel safe making noise. That image stayed with me. By morning, exhaustion weighed heavily on my body, but my mind felt sharper than it had in years. Something inside me had settled. I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't questioning whether I'd overreacted. I knew, deeply, clearly, that what happened was wrong, and pretending otherwise would only teach Emma that her pain was negotiable. After dropping Emma off at school, I sat alone in my car, phone in my hand, staring at the family group chat. I'd avoided conflict my entire life, especially written conflict. Messages couldn't be softened with tone or smiles. Once sent, they existed. Still, I started typing. I didn't accuse. I didn't insult. I didn't exaggerate. I wrote exactly what happened. I explained how Emma froze at the table, how she asked if she should stop wearing her hearing aid, how she cried herself to sleep without making a sound. I wrote about how jokes don't land the same on children, especially children who already feel different. I ended with one sentence that felt heavier than all the others combined. I will not stay quiet when my child is being hurt. I read the message 3 times before sending it. Then I pressed send. The chat went silent immediately. No reactions. No replies. No typing bubbles. Minutes turned into hours. Hours turned into days. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart jumped, only to sink again when it wasn't from anyone in my family. The silence felt intentional, like a collective decision to wait me out, to see if I'd take it back. Rachel never responded. That didn't surprise me. What surprised me was my father's silence. Growing up, he had always been the final voice, the one who closed discussions, the one whose opinion stood. I expected anger, dismissal, another lecture about being too emotional. Instead, nothing came. 3 days later, my phone finally buzzed with a message from him. I didn't realize how much it affected her, he wrote. I thought it was harmless. I'm sorry. I stared at the screen for a long time. It wasn't a perfect apology. It didn't acknowledge his role in dismissing it in the moment. It didn't mention the years of silence he'd taught me. But it was something I'd never received from him before, admission. I replied simply, "Thank you for saying that. Emma deserves better." He didn't respond again. Life didn't magically go back to normal after that. Family gatherings were tense. Invitations slowed. Conversations felt careful, measured. And yet, in the middle of all that discomfort, something else began to change. Emma began to talk more. She asked questions about her hearing aid, about why some people make jokes that hurt, about whether she should explain herself to others or ignore them. We talked openly, honestly, about kindness, about ignorance, about how sometimes adults fail too. I watched her shoulders relax in ways they hadn't before. She stopped hiding her hearing aid with her hair. She stopped asking if people noticed it. Slowly, she started reclaiming the parts of herself she'd almost learned to shrink. A few weeks later, her school announced an assembly about differences and inclusion. Emma came home holding the permission slip, her hands shaking slightly. "They asked if I want to talk," she said, "about this." She pointed to her ear. I didn't rush her. I told her it was her choice, that she didn't owe anyone an explanation. That night, she came into my room before bed. "I think I want to," she said. "I don't want to be quiet anymore." Something tightened in my chest. On the day of the assembly, I sat in the back row of the auditorium, heart pounding. Emma walked onto the stage slowly, her steps careful but steady. She took a breath, looked out at the crowd, and began to speak. She talked about how her hearing aid helped her hear her teacher's voice, how it helped her laugh with her friends, how it didn't make her different. It helped her belong. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. I saw my father standing near the back, clapping slowly, tears in his eyes. He didn't look away when our eyes met. In that moment, I understood something I'd spent my whole life learning too late. Speaking up doesn't just protect your child. It gives others a chance to grow. That dinner didn't just change how I saw my family. It changed how I saw myself. And as I watched Emma walk off that stage, taller than she'd ever looked before, I knew the silence that once ruled my life no longer had power over us. Only one chapter remained. After the school assembly, life didn't suddenly become easier, but it became clearer. There's a difference. Emma walked out of that auditorium lighter, like she had finally put something down she'd been carrying without realizing it. The applause hadn't changed who she was, but it had changed how she saw herself. And that mattered more than anything. On the drive home, she stared out the window quietly, the city passing by in soft blurs. I waited, not wanting to interrupt whatever was forming in her mind. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "Mom," she said, "I don't think I'm embarrassed anymore." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, blinking back tears. Those words felt like a victory I hadn't known how to hope for just weeks earlier. At home, things were different in small but meaningful ways. Emma stopped hesitating before answering questions in class. She corrected people when they spoke too fast instead of pretending she understood. She stopped shrinking. Watching that transformation forced me to confront something uncomfortable, how close she had come to learning that silence was safer than truth, and how easily I could have taught her that lesson myself. My relationship with my family never returned to what it was before that dinner. Some distance remained, especially with Rachel. We were polite, careful, and distant. She never apologized, never acknowledged what she'd done. For a long time, I wondered if that bothered me. Eventually, I realized it didn't. Because accountability doesn't always arrive in the form you expect. Sometimes it comes as absence. And sometimes, peace comes from accepting that not everyone is willing or able to grow with you. My father tried in his own way. He started asking Emma questions about school, about her hearing aid, about how he could help. His efforts were awkward, imperfect, and clearly unfamiliar to him, but they were real. Watching him learn so late in life was bittersweet. Part of me grieved the childhood I could have had if someone had spoken up sooner. Another part felt grateful that Emma wouldn't have to carry that same weight. One afternoon, weeks after everything had settled, Emma and I sat on the couch together, flipping through an old photo album. She stopped at a picture of me as a child, sitting at the same dining table where everything had happened. "You look quiet," she said. I smiled sadly. I was. She studied the photo for a moment, then looked up at me. "I'm glad you're not anymore." That was when I understood the full impact of that night. The dinner hadn't just been about a joke. It had been about a pattern. A legacy of silence passed down quietly, generation by generation. And for the first time, that legacy stopped with me. I used to believe that keeping the peace meant keeping quiet, that love meant endurance, that family deserved forgiveness even when it came at the cost of self-respect. But standing up for Emma rewrote those beliefs completely. Love isn't passive, protection isn't subtle, and silence isn't noble when it teaches a child to doubt herself. Sometimes being a good parent means being misunderstood. It means being labeled dramatic, sensitive, difficult. It means walking away from tables you were taught never to leave. And I would do it again. Every time. Because the cost of speaking up is temporary. The cost of staying silent lasts much longer. Emma still wears her hearing aid proudly. Some days are harder than others. Some comments still sting. The world hasn't suddenly become kinder. But now, she knows something vital. That her worth isn't decided by someone else's laughter. And I know something too, that the strongest thing I ever did wasn't raising my voice. It was choosing my child when it mattered most. If you're listening to this, and you've ever stayed quiet to keep others comfortable, I want you to hear this clearly. Your silence teaches someone something. Make sure it's not teaching them to disappear. That night at the dinner table took something from us, but it gave us something too. It gave us clarity, courage, and a future where my daughter doesn't have to ask if she's too much, too different, or not enough. Because she is enough. And I finally learned that so am I.